Daniel Dwyer 5, July 3rd, 2023 AD. It had been almost a full 3 weeks since Daniel had turned 18 years old, and despite Dr. Foster's pleas and objections, administration was preparing to release him from the asylum. Dr. Foster had been Daniel's primary caretaker and advocate since his admission to the asylum over 8 years ago. He'd taken a keen interest in Daniel right from the start, interest above and beyond that to which he was professionally obligated. He thought that the boy was fascinating, and had so ever since their initial meeting. He was convinced that the boy with the 8-ball was capable of achievements far greater than it would seem, well beyond that which one would intuitively deduce by observing him. He didn't see the limitations without also discerning the advantages of his patient's condition, perhaps because of his lifelong adherence to a philosophy which bid him to actively seek out the positive aspects of bad situations. He thought in a positive way, so his world was a little brighter for it. On this day, however, Dr. Foster was distraught. Daniel Dwyer, his most fascinating patient, the central subject of his study, was being released. He thought that the word release was inappropriate to describe the prospect, more like abandonment, he had said. The director, not without compassion, had considered his request to stay their normal procedure and managed to justify allowing the man with the 8-ball, Mr. 8 to the other patients, to remain nearly 3 weeks beyond his scheduled release date. He, in that time, feigned passing attempts at researching the policy to look for loopholes, but knowing from the start that he would find nothing of value, admittedly had done so not so much for the sake of Mr. 8, but for the sake of Dr. Foster. He tried to keep everyone happy, his staff most of all, but was ruled by the dollar in the end and could not justify the expense of housing and accommodating a patient that they were no longer being compensated for. Test results indicated that Daniel could function in society, not at any level one might consider thriving, but on paper, he was fit to live in a halfway house. He met the minimum criteria for release. The good doctor fought against this. He was convinced, and rightly so, that the contingency of the medium, namely the use of his 8-ball being necessary for him to survive, negated the validity of this conclusion. In short, the doctor feared what might happen to Daniel when someone takes his 8-ball from him and never returns it. For all intents and purposes, that would be the end of his life. He would be completely defenseless and would likely die of thirst and starvation without it. And he knew people to be malicious, and he knew that it would only take one. 1,000 and 1,000 more people could let the peculiar mute with the 8-ball subsist left in peace, but it's that one he fears. If and when that one decides to run away with his 8-ball, that would be it. Daniel's 8-ball is irreplaceable. Only the original will suffice to serve Daniel's needs. They tried at the asylum on many occasions to substitute it for other objects, everything from other 8-balls of the same construction to handwritten messages on paper to pictures of acts among so many other random things. Nothing else seemed to invoke a response from him. The 8-ball that he had come in with was the only thing that worked. Stripped of it, Daniel was as good as dead. Dr. Foster was fairly certain that this was the reason that Daniel had killed that orderly those years back. Yes, he knew that it was Daniel that had killed him. He didn't know how he knew, but from the very moment that he'd heard what had happened, he knew that Daniel was responsible. His very first thought when he came into the ward that day and found out what had transpired was, I wonder what he did to make Daniel do that. There was no doubt in his mind that it was Daniel that had killed him, and there was no doubt in his mind that Daniel had remained asleep as he did so, as there was no doubt that it had been done by means of some form of telekinesis. He didn't say anything to anyone because it would sound crazy, but in his mind he had intuited correctly what had happened the night of the orderly's death, almost as if he somehow knew that it was a commonplace occurrence for Daniel to do as he does. And yet he continued to work with the boy with the 8-ball completely unafraid. He watched and waited, waiting for some proof of truth for what he held on faith. When the hammer finally came down and it was time to usher Daniel out into the world, almost as if by instinct, Dr. Foster came to a snap decision and announced that he would take care of Daniel and house the young man himself. There was a bit of a fuss, but in the end he got his way. So after about 5.5 hours of phone calls, emailing documents, and filling out paperwork, the deed was done. Daniel was coming to live with the kindly doctor, and the timing of it all couldn't have been more perfect for one very lucky little girl. For if the man with the 8-ball hadn't by chance seen her in passing, she might have been dead within the hour. Ana Hernandez was 11 years old, and she thought Justin was her friend, so she ignored the warning signs and dismissed the gut feeling that told her not to get into the car, and she got into the car. Justin's older brother and his friends were in town, and they were going to go and party. Justin, the cool bad boy from down the block, was 13. Anna thought he was cute, and she had always talked about how she wanted to try some of the things they were talking about, like smoking weed and getting drunk. So she decided to get in the car with the 4 boys. It was Justin and his brother, 17, and his brother's friends, who were quite a bit older than they were, one 19 and one 21. The way the 19-year-old watched her was unsettling. What was going through his mind was worse. She came from a line of curvy women and couldn't help the fact that she looked older than she was. When Justin had texted her to invite her out, she had changed into clothes that showed off her body. She thought Justin was cute after all. She was a virgin, of course. She was just a big talker, and sometimes said off-the-wall things like, "I would suck his dick so hard," when talking about a cute singer or actor. Things that made Justin think of her when his brother's friends asked if he knew any slutty girls. She had no idea what their intentions were when she got into the car, ignoring her intuition to back out on the invite, unable to think of a lie sufficient to get out of it right on the spot, and for fear that Justin might not want to invite her out with him again in the future. She had a bad feeling, but she rationalized it, surrendering her better judgment in favor of looking cool, and got into the back seat of the car, greeted by the 21-year-old with a "Hey, sexy," and a wolf whistle from the 19-year-old. Justin smacked her on the ass as she climbed over him when she was asked to sit in the middle, something he'd never even come close to doing before. She liked it. He must have felt emboldened by the visit from his brother. What she didn't like was when the 19-year-old put his hand on her thigh, but she didn't want to be rude, so she just let him rub her thigh and faked a smile. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. All she'd said was, "I'm going outside." Then they drove off with their beer, their weed, and their ass in tow, and headed for the woods to get her high and go from there. If it weren't for Daniel, she would never have been seen alive again. When they were a little over halfway there in the smoked-out car, the 19-year-old, his clammy hand exploring ever more of her thigh, asked her if she'd ever sucked a dick before. When she coyly said no, Justin's brother looked at her from the rearview mirror and said, "Well, we can fix that." She was stoned for the first time, mind flying. She didn't want to be there, but she was already in too deep. It took all the willpower she had to keep from crying and begging for them to take her home. Instead, she bit her lip and went along for the ride, trying to pretend to enjoy herself. As she stared out the window, she locked eyes for a moment with a strange-looking man in the back seat of a passing car. Dr. Foster didn't notice that Daniel had turned his head to watch the passing vehicle, something highly uncharacteristic of him, subtle as the movement was. Daniel then looked into his 8-ball and went to sleep, head drooping down until it came to rest on the back of the driver's seat behind the good doctor. When he noticed that he'd put himself to sleep, Dr. Foster quietly said aloud to himself, "Where are you going, Daniel? What did you see?" Alexander 7, May 11th, 13,416,442,389 BC. The universe had now been in existence for nearly 300 million years, the vast majority of that time in utter, inescapable darkness. There were giants abound in the reaches around, but not one could be seen. So massive were some of these unseen forms that Alexander could feel their influence, though he himself was bereft of mass. Where physical properties were concerned, he had no unwilling interactions. He was made of no substance, not real, but actual. Still, so strong was the sway of the invisible giants afloat in the dark that even in his non-corporeal form he felt their presence. When the light of the first star ignited, it triggered the chain reaction for star formation throughout the universe. Galaxies had been forming for a long time in the dark, material amassing due to mutual attraction by way of their intrinsic gravity. Gravity is caused by the displacement of space in the presence of mass. To put it simply, where there is material evidence of existence, namely matter, There is a coinciding hole in space to accommodate its presence, and an ensuing gravity well is formed. When there is more matter compressed into a smaller space, the hole deepens. Relative to the varying amount of material compiled in a given space at the conclusion of the accretion process, one finds that it becomes more and more challenging to resist the gravity of a given body, depending on how much material has been accreted and how effectively it has been compacted. But this is a losing game. The end result of succumbing to mutual gravitational attraction when allotted too much material in too confined a space is the creation of a death trap, a black hole. For black holes have such an amount of gravity that in order to accelerate to a speed sufficient to overcome their gravity, one would have to exceed the speed of light, which is not possible. Considering energy itself is intrinsically traveling at light speed within its respective confines, it is impossible to supply enough energy to surpass the needs required to go any faster than light. The energy required to push something has to be greater than the energy of the object being pushed. So that which is referred to as its relativistic mass increases to the point where it can go no faster, because no energy supply is sufficient to push it any farther. Alexander would, in his teachings, shed much light on this concept of relativistic mass when an object's energy becomes so great that it can take on no more. They filled his view, the looming hollows. The influence of these giants was so humongous, their gravity wells so deep, that light itself could not escape from them. In the ages to come, it is assumed that black holes form from the collapse of stars after gravity wins out over the outward push of the nuclear reactions in their course. While this is one method of creating a black hole, it is obviously not the only one. For that was what Alexander saw when the first light of the first stars began to light up reality. Black holes were already there and in great numbers. The first black holes had foregone star formation altogether and began their lives as black holes before the first star ever shined, never having to have combated the outward push of fusion to begin with, not an anomaly, but the standard of the time. They were the main attraction, in fact, several of the more insanely massive of them seated at the centers of giant clouds, some surrounded by swirling disks of dust that stretched for eons. With time, the light of star formation swept across the universe, igniting more and more stars into being along its path. But the beasts abounded. They had come in the dark, huge amounts of material having foregone star formation entirely and directly collapsed into their looming states. It was a world of black holes. The measure of light from the stars that was not straightaway engulfed and imprisoned in the black holes danced around the edges of them as though they were being warped through a tilted lens. Any light unfortunate enough to fall into the black hole, to cross the point of no return known as the event horizon, would never again emerge, nor would any mass or energy. It would never be able to exceed the escape velocity requirements of the black hole. The gravity well was too deep. Space was falling in faster than the light could pass it, like a fish challenged to climb a waterfall. The only hope of escape is to revert to a baser elementary particle and bind with an antiparticle in the hopes that one will materialize outside the event horizon, straddling the quantum realm. This deterioration process would come to be known as Hawking radiation, but is such a slow process that it is veritably imperceptible and combated by the absorption of any new material. The light of the last stars would fade before the first supermassive black holes would disintegrate. The early stars were giants in their own right, and went through their life cycles so quickly that by the time the earliest of them had exploded in giant supernovae, the light of the first star had not yet even reached the farthest reaches of space. There were still places where none of its light had been seen even after the source of the first starlight had already gone, places for which it would only ever be light. It had lived and died, but to some it didn't even exist yet. This is the fickle nature of perspective. Alexander in his teachings would spend a lot of time dissecting these concepts of relative simultaneity and the principle of equivalence. All things exist at their own unique rate of time, as would be demonstrated. It would be another several 100 million years before the universe became recognizable, and several billion more beyond before Alexander would finally end his search. Then Alexander would be alone no more.